The advice we all get when we're younger about how to be charismatic is just be yourself. And then most people, they say, well, I'm being myself, but it's not working. Like, what if being myself sucks? You're not actually being yourself. You're being yourself as filtered through this complex webbing of social conditioning. And we talk about social conditioning quite a lot. But what does it actually mean? We talk about it in a very generalized fashion, but we don't really get down to the specifics of what it entails. First of all, I mean, there's black and white thinking, off, on, up, down, right, wrong. I do this or I do this. In the example of somebody trying to, meet somebody for romantic purposes, like, do I go direct or do I go indirect? Do I go high energy? Do I go low energy? Do I go more humble or kind of narcissistic and irreverent? When you're faced with any of these seeming opposites, understand it's a continuum. And on the one side, you have this, let's say again, direct, indirect. The greatest point of vitality along a spectrum of seeming opposites is through the synthesis of the poles. So meaning it's not going to be X or Y. That's not the best decision. Like, do I go this or do I go that? For example, if I'm talking to somebody, I might be very indirect, where it's just kind of very casual. And then over the course of a sentence, it becomes very direct and then back to indirect. Like over the course of a couple seconds, it could shift the energy. I could go high energy, low energy, and back and forth and back and forth. This is why a lot of times people in the comments will say, well, in a previous video, you said this thing that seems to contradict what you're saying here. Which is which? Do I do X? Do I do Y? Well, the answer is both. But that conditioning of society is very black and white thinking. So people tend to get hung up on these, seeming opposites. Another huge one, which we're all familiar with, is judgmentalism. This compulsive need to make negative judgments and to be judged ourselves negatively that causes a lot of these so-called tension entanglements that we talk about a lot here. And look, yeah, judgments, it's necessary. Like, the mind is not a villain. The mind is needed to make creative, discerning choices in the moment of, okay, do I say this or this? They're both good ideas. Let's do that one, that one. Okay, what do I do here? Where am I in the interaction? What are the next steps? How do I move it towards that? Are there logistical obstacles? Judgment is required, but when it becomes very generalized, like I suck, why? I don't know, I just suck, right? Or when it becomes predictive, if I do that, I'll look stupid. If I do that, they'll think I'm weird. If I do that, I could get embarrassed. That's when the problems occur. So again, we want to distinguish between these two faces of judgment, so to speak, and not throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you judge in advance, it will prevent you from trying anything unknown. And this is why on my programs, the live program, I strive to create a non-judgmental exercise space, because it's only then that you're going to be able to leap through the fear into the unknown where the growth happens. And very often you'll look back in retrospect, you're like, why the fuck was I so scared to try that? It was actually quite easy. I could have been doing this for the past 5 years. I could have been doing this whole time, is what you're saying. But because you created this unpleasant judgmental exercise space inside of yourself, that's what prevented you from taking that action. You can't predict success or failure. This is something I'm always telling people. So you hesitate, you get wrapped up, you judge, you don't move at all, and then you lose the opportunity for growth. We very often entertain negative outcomes before we approach somebody, right? Oh, that person next to them, that's their significant other. They'll be mad and they'll get up in my shit. They have a unpleasant facial expression on their face. I'm going to go up and they're going to be like, dude, don't fucking talk to me. You have no idea. You could go up to that person and it's like I had a situation where my assistant, this is when he was not an assistant, he was simply a student. We were at Encore Beach Club on a Sunday. It was the daytime and everyone's running around and it's the pool party. They're in the bikinis and everyone's got their shirt off, da 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 da. And there's this one lady sitting there at a table and she's there with 5 dudes. And I told various students, hey, maybe go meet her. They're like, oh no, the dudes. I tell this kid, my now assistant, I'm like, there. He's like, oh, with the guys? Okay. He just goes in. The dudes they look over, they're like, meh, completely ignored. They don't care. It turns out they're coworkers. They're there on a work trip and they give 0 fucks. They're just like, oh, cool. Gwendolyn's met somebody. Okay. And he ended up going to the, back to the hotel for a drink with her, and da. One thing led to another. So again, you don't want to be like this, having this predictive judgment It's just speculating. There's also the concept of negativity bias. Like, for example, like sometimes I'll be giving this is kind of funny. Sometimes I'll be giving a speech and like say at the free tour, and there will be the entire crowd is loving it. And there's like one dude in the fucking crowd who's just sitting there kind of like mean mugging. And it doesn't matter that there's like 200 people there that are like enjoying it. That there's one guy, and I'll like focus on that fucking guy. I'll be like, that fucking guy. And then the funny thing is too, usually after the talk ends, I'll like come down and he'll come to the back and I'll be like, hey man, thanks for coming into town. It was amazing. I got a lot out of it. I'm like, well, why were you sitting there like scowling the whole time? It's just that's what his face looks like. The power to free yourself from this judgmental blocking, it's cumulative, right? It's going to be difficult at first, but the more that you do it, the more freely you're going to be able to act going forward. Again, all learning is movement into the unknown. So the greater the freedom from prejudging, from trying to predict what's going to happen, the greater the learning and the greater the growth. There's a lot of other conditionings that we could talk about specifically. I'd say we talked about this idea of responsibility. Nathaniel Brandon talks a lot about that in his 6 pillars of self-esteem. It's one of the pillars is taking responsibility for your life, not blaming external circumstances. Defensiveness is a huge one. It's very common in boot camp students I see. Because, and here's the thing, like it's particularly with dating, since it's so results oriented, it's easy as a coach for me to be like, what you did there was wrong. Like that's wrong, don't do that. But the second you kind of frame it as that, they get their dander up and they're like, well, they'll very often defend it as a choice. They're like, this is why I'm doing this. It's because this, it's just how I am and blah, 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 blah. And there's the reason. And they get very, very defensive. But again, the greater the defensiveness, the less the learning. Perfectionism, it's another big conditioning. Nothing's good enough. You're not good enough. It'll never be good enough. Ironically, the effort to be perfect contains within it the very interference that blocks movement towards perfection, even though there is no such thing in a process. You are a process, not a product. And it's really easy to see yourself as a product, particularly when somebody rejects your approach. You're like, well, I guess the product sucks, but really what they're just rejecting is you at that moment. Frozen feelings is another conditioning that's very, very prevalent. This idea that you got to hide what you feel. And from a very young age, again, don't be loud in the restaurant, don't run around, don't exhibit exuberance, don't cry. People who show emotions are threatening to the system. So it's better that and again, the quality of the emotion is not an issue here. Whether it's positive, negative, doesn't matter. It must be hidden, it must be controlled. As soon as an impulse to express comes up, the impulse to suppress it comes up almost immediately thereafter, like almost at the very same moment in time. So it gets tamped down. Now, the thing is, that energy, just because it's not expressed, doesn't mean it goes away. It's still tamped down and it wants to express more. It's this cycle, this sort of like self-perpetuating cycle, where ultimately you get to a point where you assume that the repression of the emotion is its expression. And this is why you see things where like guys, they just can't, their facial expression is just stone-faced. Like this guy I had this past weekend, his voice, no matter what you tell him to do, it just cannot go over a certain level of volume. I said to this guy, is my physical apparatus somehow superior to yours where I'm physically able to talk louder than you are? No, we have the same essential equipment. But again, there's this frozen feelings type thing, type of conditioning going on that's preventing you from getting over that certain level of volume. There's dishonesty, lying to yourself. There's confusion, I think is a big one. No one is more controllable than a confused person, because all of the energy is spent trying to figure out what's going on, and then there's no energy left at the end to make any meaningful change. With me and these programs, again, this mentoring, the boot camps, I'm trying to demystify shit. And very often, it's funny because previously we've been accused of, well, you make all these videos and you make it this like Byzantine labyrinth of intellectual exercises in order to confuse people so they have to keep coming and taking more fucking programs. It's like, well, no, we make those videos to kind of elaborate on certain things, rabbit holes people might want to go down, but ultimately, a lot of this, it's very, very simple, right? It's not complicated. It's not easy because of these conditionings, but inhibiting you from taking the actions, behaving in the ways that would get the results, but ultimately it's relatively simple. I'm trying to give the power back to you because it's your power. But awareness is the first step, right? That's what we always say. Developing awareness of these things is the first step. Don't add extra judgment, extra guilt, extra shame on top, because again, that's what caused most of this stuff in the first place. It's become aware, explore, let them go, and then learn to replace their manifestations in your life.